Hey, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest Professor Katy Milkman, who's a professor at the Wharton School and author of a best-selling book called How to Change. Katy, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Katy, let me start by asking you, I noticed you have a PhD in computer science and business. How did you go from there to doing what you do now?
It was not a direct route. My path started as an engineer as an undergraduate, and I thought engineering was fabulous. Lots of wonderful data analysis skills, but I knew I wanted to apply those data analysis skills to solve practical problems. I just hadn't quite figured out which ones. And as a graduate student at Harvard in computer science and business, I had to take a required microeconomics sequence of graduate classes. And it was this is almost 20 years ago now. Behavioral economics was just taking off as a field, and Harvard was sort of a hotbed of it. So this is the idea that not only should we model people as perfectly rational decision makers, but actually we should incorporate some of the imperfections. The fact that, for instance, they're impatient, that we overweight losses, that they loom larger than gains, that there are all these systematic ways that we deviate from optimality. So that was actually incorporated into this microeconomics class I had to take, and I was absolutely fascinated. I got hooked immediately. I thought, like, this is what I've been looking for and waiting for my whole life. In fact, I had hated the rational actor model so much as an undergrad when I encountered it in sort of introductory economics that I went to summer school to become an engineer so I could do an applied mathematical undergraduate major that didn't require economics. So I fell in love kind of late, but then I was able to steer my path. I was very lucky that I had a lot of flexible faculty members and mentors who said, like, okay, if you are in love with these ideas from behavioral economics and you want to use a data-driven approach and look at, internet data and so on to try to find ways that people make mistakes, we can sort of make that work with your PhD. And I've been doing behavioral science and behavioral economics ever since.
Interesting. So what was your PhD on? What did you end up doing your PhD on?
You're gonna laugh because I feel like such a dinosaur. But it wasn't that long ago. So do you remember that Netflix used to mail you physical DVDs, not like streaming? It wasn't a thing. In fact, they literally just shut down. There were apparently some small number of customers still receiving their DVDs by mail.
I know one of them, yes.
You do? Okay. Well, I guess if we're like into, really esoteric films, some of them still aren't available on streaming. So they kept this going. It was a couple months ago, I think, that they shut it down completely. But it used to be the way we all did it.
Right.
So my dissertation used data from a Netflix copycat in Australia called QuickFlix that had the same business model. And P.S., I once upon a time had Netflix data, and then there was a whole legal disaster. So I did the project twice. But anyway, the final dissertation looked at that data, and it looked at it showed that people hold highbrow films systematically longer than lowbrow films. So predictably procrastinate on watching movies that are sort of good for you. So think documentaries as opposed to action flicks. And also that we could see systematic preference reversals, which is like a big deal to economists if people flip their preferences. So I would look at the queue order, right? People like make a rank ordered list of the movies they want to watch in what order, and they get sent in that order. So I know what order you thought you were going to watch them in, but then I'd look at the order in which you mailed them back. And I'd show there were systematic and predictable reversals where basically if you get a lowbrow film after a highbrow film, you reverse yourself and you watch the action flick before the documentary and send it back. So you're like, yeah, of course I'm going to watch this documentary, but in reality, like, well, tomorrow actually. So it was about procrastination. It was about, impatience. That was the centerpiece of my dissertation. And I did some other stuff with actually online grocery data showing when we order for more immediate delivery, we order less healthy items and spend more, which is related. So it was a combination of these sort of like internet startup at the time companies and showing ways that we could use that new data to demonstrate people were systematically making different decisions as a function of the time frame when their choice would take effect.
Yeah, interesting. So I love the title of your book, The Key to Change, because I can ask you, what is the key to change?
Yeah, how do you change?
Let's start with that.
Yeah. Well, okay, the central premise is that there's no one answer. So that will make this a longer and more interesting conversation than if I could be like, here's the key to change, there's only one. So the book is about the fact, in fact, part of the reason I wrote it is everybody I would talk to was like, okay, how do we do it? We want to get my employees to start saving more for retirement, or taking care of themselves, or being more productive. I need them to change, or a public health department. Like, how do we get everybody to get their vaccines? Whatever the question is.
Yeah.
What's your answer? And basically the answer is it depends. And actually we do too little work to figure out what it depends on in order to give the right solution. So the short story is, what is the obstacle? And we need to spend a moment at least thinking about that. Of course, that's true. It's true that there's lots of external obstacles, but even if everything in like you have all your finances lined up, your health is great, and it's just you're the barrier. That's really where my work begins. And there's a series of different challenges that we have to overcome internally to get where we want to be, and that we see over and over again. But depending on which one you're up against, you want to use a different science-based solution. So let me give you a couple examples to make this more concrete.
For sure.
Say you aren't exercising regularly. It might be because like you haven't sort of slotted it into your schedule. Life is too busy. You never make the time. You never you not mean to do it, but it always gets sort of bumped to the bottom priority. And so then we need to work on, planning, scheduling, reminders, sort of making it a priority in your schedule. Okay. That's a totally different barrier than the reason you don't exercise is I freaking hate it. As soon as I get there, I'm miserable and I never want to go again. So I always put it on the calendar and then I'm like, I'm going to pop in this lowbrow TV show. It just didn't come back. This lowbrow film to come back to where we started. And I'm going to sit on the couch. So is it that it's miserable to do the action while you're there and we need to change the nature of the experience so that you actually don't procrastinate and put it off because it's only providing delayed rewards? We need to make it more instantly gratifying? Or is it about planning? So there's a whole list of barriers that I sort of walk through in the book and that my research has looked at. Everything from the challenge of getting started, finding the moment when you have the motivation to begin, to the challenge of impulsivity, that we're guided by what feels good in the moment. And if the behavior, the goal you want to achieve doesn't feel good, if the change you want to achieve is not instantly gratifying, you delay. To forgetfulness, to habits that can stand in your way. Confidence can be a barrier, and even your social, the social network and social feedback you're getting. So the book is structured. Each chapter is about a different barrier that is common, that can obstruct change, and what science shows can help overcome that barrier. So, basically, a lot of books in this space neglect that step. In fact, most people trying to solve these problems neglect that step. And I think that's one of the key reasons we see a lot more failure than we need to, is if you just jump straight to like, okay, I'm going to set a goal and I'm going to get it done. And you don't think about what are the obstacles that might prevent success and how can I develop a strategy based in evidence that I can use to overcome those barriers, you don't get as far as you could.
So give me an example of the most common barrier, would you say, and the data and the science that you can use to overcome that barrier?
Yeah, it's a great question. I started down the path of one really common one, and P.S. it's related to my dissertation. I talked a little bit about impulsivity. A super common challenge is that we don't enjoy pursuing our goals. Where our goals are, they give us long-term value, right? I'm going to get in shape. I'm going to learn a new language. I'm going to meditate regularly. I am, whatever it is. But in the moment, it's less instantly gratifying than some other activity you should be, you could engage in, right? Like I'd rather pop in a TV show or sit on a couch than go to the gym, then study my Spanish, then work on this report. Okay, so the instant gratification is a huge barrier. It's really common. And there's some really wonderful research by Ayelet Fishbach at the University of Chicago and Caitlin Woolley at Cornell that I think is critically important to understand when thinking about this barrier, which is most of us, when we encounter or when we have a goal, we think, I am going to look for the most efficient and direct route to get from here to that goal. And that's how I'm gonna make progress. And that sounds smart. I'm an engineer, like efficiency, yay, right? Of course. But actually turns out that if we encourage people not to pursue their goals in the way that's most efficient, but in the way that they will enjoy the most in the moment, we get better results because people persist longer. So if you're thinking about, let's just use the gym because it's a nice, easy one everyone can wrap their head around, a goal a lot of people have, or exercise more generally, you could think about getting on the maximally, fitness producing machine. Maybe it's a Stairmaster that like burns the most calories per second and helps you achieve your exercise goals. But you might find that miserable. Alternatively, if you're thinking what's the most fun thing to do, you might say like Zumba classes with my best friend. Well, if you go to the Zumba classes with your best friend, you're actually going to achieve the goal with higher probability. And the reason is you're going to keep going because you won't find it miserable while you're there. I like to call this the sort of the Mary Poppins effect. Mary Poppins says like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. We too often neglect. Most people have the wrong mental model. We think efficiency over fun, but the reality of the research is actually fun beats efficiency in terms of goal achievement. And I have specifically done some research in this area that actually even predated the work by Caitlin and Ayelet on something I call temptation bundling, which is a technique specifically designed to deal with this challenge, which basically is what if you only let yourself enjoy a temptation while pursuing a goal that feels like a chore. So let's stay with the gym. And actually we were talking about, entertainment. What if you only let yourself binge watch your favorite lowbrow TV show while you're exercising? Now all of a sudden you're going to start looking forward to going to the gym at the end of the day because you get to find out what happens to your favorite characters. Time's going to fly while you're watching TV and exercising. And P.S., in the package, you maybe reduce wasted time at home when you could be doing something more productive. So, and there's lots of chores and temptations you can think about bundling. So that's another way to make it fun. You can also make it social. We've done some research about when you engage in a goal in tandem with someone else who you like, you both get accountability because somebody else is sort of, now if you don't show up, you're letting someone else down, and you enjoy it more, and that leads to better results net. So there's a bunch of different ways to add that spoonful of sugar on top, but I think that may be the most common mistake we make when it comes to thinking about diagnosis of why we won't achieve. We neglect to recognize that it has to be actually enjoyable in the moment. We have to find some way to sugarcoat the activity so that we won't constantly procrastinate and put off until tomorrow what we need to do today.
Is it usually the case that the barriers boil down to kind of one thing, or because I'm thinking it could be a combination of things. What usually is the barrier for most impediments?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I think you're right to think that often it's multiply determined. Like maybe I'm not working out regularly, both because I didn't make a plan and because it wasn't any fun.
Yeah.
And I think in those cases, then you can layer things on top of each other. But often it is the case that it's one or the other. So think about the situation where maybe you're not taking your medication for, say you need to take Lipitor to lower your risk of a heart attack, right? And you're not doing that regularly. It could be a forgetting barrier. That could be it. It could be that there's side effects. It could be both, but probably more likely in some of these cases, we can get straight to the heart of it pretty easily by thinking carefully through sort of almost like a checklist. What are the possibilities? And different people will see different things. But I don't think it's always multiply determined. Sometimes it really is like, I just keep forgetting, or, I really freaking hate it. It's miserable. And sometimes another big one I would say is confidence. Like, I just don't believe I can do it. And so I sort of have given up on myself and need to find a way to feel like there's hope.
Now, these sound like really great tips for obviously things in your personal life. Does the book go into how you can also make changes in the corporate world, in your work world? Talk to me a little bit about maybe an example or two of that.
Yeah, actually, most of my research, I'm almost wondering if there's any counterexamples. Almost all of it, maybe all of it, is done in contexts where I partner with organizations that are hoping to change or create positive change in the lives of their employees or their customers. And that's where, and that's how we sort of look at it. Let me give you one example would be in terms of, actually, this is sort of an unusual example since you're talking about the corporate world, but I think you'll still see that it's related to productivity in an organizational context. So this is a project we did with an organization called Crisis Text Line. And they're an amazing organization. If somebody's in crisis and they need to communicate with someone else, like they need feedback quickly to help them get through that crisis, you can basically text and you'll get a live volunteer communicating with you who's been thoroughly trained in how to help you work through that crisis moment. They have an incredible platform for training volunteers, but like every volunteer-based organization, they have a lot of churn. and they follow some best practices already in terms of trying to get people to make a minimum commitment of time before they go through the rigorous training program to become a crisis counselor. You're supposed to commit to 200 hours of volunteering a year. So it's a big commitment, and it is a really big chunk of time you spend training. But most people are not living up to that commitment, which is typical. So they wanted to boost the productivity of this sort of volunteer army, if you will. Maybe army is the wrong word given what the kind of organization, but anyway, you know what I mean. And so they came to us, and we sort of looked at what could we do, what were ways that we might be able to innovate and improve. And there was an incredibly simple strategy that we took, which is that they were already sending weekly reminder emails to people about their 200-hour-a-year commitment and saying, hey, sign up for some hours this week, make progress towards your commitment. And they were getting some take up. And we said, let's break that really big goal down into bite-sized parts. Because one of the things we know is that for people to feel like they're making goal progress and to feel like there's something tangible that they can achieve right now, so they get that sort of bing of instant gratification, you want smaller bite-sized pieces. But actually, this has mostly been studied in the laboratory, and we wanted to study it in a more organizationally relevant context. So we randomly assign people to get these reminder emails each week about signing up for some time to volunteer to make their 200-hour yearly commitment. Some people got the standard mailing that says do a little each week, but some people said, try to do 4 hours each week, because PS 200 hours divided by 52. Anyway, that's how that works. And then some people, we also tried a slight variant on that. We said, try to do 8 hours every 2 weeks. Maybe that would be slightly more flexible. What we see is about an 8 percentage point improvement in volunteering time and productivity just by making that tiny change, where we're now breaking this big goal down into a bite-sized piece so that it feels more digestible and actionable right now. Like there's something I can do to check that box. So to me, that's very organizationally relevant as we think about breaking down big goals, right? We have a quarterly goal for an employee or a yearly goal for an employee, something large you're working towards. And you want to think about, how do I get them to achieve more? How can I change their productivity and create better outcomes in my organization? Well, one of the things may be that you've given them too big of a bite, too big of a goal, and we need to break that down into bite-sized pieces so they can think about something they can do daily or weekly to make progress. And a simple framing change can be really effective. I think that's really relevant to lots of organizations and lots of employees. And then, there's lots of other examples, but that's one that comes to mind first.
How important does habit play into this? Because a lot of the things you talk about seem like, they're either good habits or bad habits, or the people who do it. I mean, how does that factor in? Is that something that becomes an impediment, or something that, makes it easier for some people? What is your research on that?
Well, both. So you're spot on that if your habits are, misaligned with your goals, it's an impediment. But if you can align them, it can become a resource. So it can be either. And so this is one of the areas where I think being deliberate and thinking through, then how do I build habits that are an asset rather than a liability is really, really important. And are my habits what is standing in my way? And there is great straightforward research both in animals and in humans that looks at what is the cycle that creates habit, and we can be deliberate about trying to build them. It's almost like practice is what you need. I know that sounds bizarre, right? When you think about something like mastering a new skill, like I want to learn the piano, you think about sitting down and practicing, but we don't normally think about practicing a habit. But actually it's a similar process. You want to create consistent amount of time so that you can engage in the behavior, and until it starts to feel more like second nature and muscle memory as opposed to something that requires effort. You want to make sure that it's rewarding so that you're getting the positive feedback, enjoying it, the gratification, whether that's because you are tracking your progress and you're giving yourself sort of kudos for each time that you can mark down that you've achieved it, or you even have a more elaborate system that you've set up of self-reward than that. But you want to associate a positive, pleasant association with engaging in the behavior. One thing that we've found in our research, though, that I would say is really surprising, and I spend a fair amount of time talking about that in the book, and this is based on an experiment we did with Google employees with about 2,500 of them in a randomized controlled trial. We had the theory that the best way to build habits, and so did most psychologists, would be consistency in terms of time of day when you're engaging in this sort of practice startup phase where you're trying to put it on autopilot. So we did this whole experiment where we basically tested, is it better to get people really consistent in performing a behavior they want to put on autopilot, or is it actually better to be more variable in when you engage in the behavior? And the big surprise for us was that what we actually found is it was better to deliberately practice at inconsistent times than consistent ones. Now, I want to couch that in saying we had 2 experimental groups in this study, both of whom wanted to form a habit around a behavior, and they both made a sort of first best plan for the best time to do it every day that was consistent. They got a reminder to do it at that time, but one group was only rewarded if they did it in this narrow time window, and the other group was rewarded regardless. They both perform the behavior at the same frequency, but one is like 85% it's always the same time of day. The other, it's about 50% it's the same time of day. Then after this sort of reward startup phase ends, it goes on for a month, we look and see who's continuing to do it at a higher rate. And this is where the surprise comes. It's the people who are less consistent about performing it at the same time of day. They actually ended up with a more robust, consistent pattern of habit. And the reason becomes really clear when we look at the data. What's happening is basically the people who really rigid way, like I'm a 7 a.m., I do this at 7 a.m. or bust. If they miss their magic window, they don't do it at all. So they're decent about getting to it at that window. They sort of formed a habit around that time, but often they don't. And then it falls apart. The people who were a little bit more variable in their startup phase when they're practicing and trying to put this habit on autopilot, okay, they maybe do it a little bit less often at their sweet spot time, but if they miss that time, they're very likely to get to it at another time. And net that leads to more success. So one of the really interesting things I take away from that about habit is when we are in sort of practice reward mode and trying to build out plans, we should have a first best plan, but also a sort of plan B, right? What if you can't get to the gym in the morning before dropping off your kids because there's a traffic jam, or after dropping off your kids because there's a traffic jam, or what if you can't do your meditation during lunch because you have a lunch meeting? You need a plan B, and you actually want to practice that plan B just as you'd practice your plan A to build a consistent habit. So think about rigidity as the enemy of building habits, and practice as important.
Interesting. What talks to me a little about the instant gratification part, because that does seem like it really plays into it. I mean, is that a very key and fundamental thing that somehow you create to give yourself instant gratification of some kind to make the task or whatever it is appealing or more doable?
It is really important. We are wired to be what's called present biased. We overvalue instant gratification we obtain from whatever activity we're deciding between doing or not. Yeah. And we undervalue the long-term rewards. It's just the way we're designed. And so there's sort of 2 ways around that. One is change the nature of the task, change the chore to make it more instantly gratifying. You can temptation bundle, you can pursue it in a different way, you can make it social. The second way to deal with this challenge is through what economists call commitment devices. And basically that's just changing the other side of the equation. So either you can take a present biased person and make it more fun to do the thing so that they won't put it off, or you can actually make it so darn costly not to do the thing because you've changed the long-term calculus that they're like, oh, I guess I have to do it anyway, even though it sounds miserable. So that's a commitment device. And, we're used to them in life, right? Your boss, when they give you a deadline, or they're like, you'll get fired if you don't do X, or you won't get a bonus if you don't do X. They're incentivizing you. They're changing the long-term value, but you can actually change the equation the same way yourself, even though it sounds kind of counterintuitive. There are tools you can use, like you can put money on the line that you will have to forfeit if you fail to achieve your goals. And there are actually websites that exist to let you do this, which I have no affiliation with. So like stick.com and Beeminder will let you commit money that you'd give to a charity, maybe even a charity you hate, like on, they have either side of hot button issues represented, like your gun control versus the NRA. You pick your poison. You choose a referee who will hold you accountable. It could be a digital device if it's a, something like step count. And then they take your credit card, and if you don't achieve your goal, you get fined. And that changes the price of your vice. And there's excellent research showing this is really valuable. So one of my favorite studies looks at smoking cessation and shows that smokers who are randomly assigned to have access to a place where they can put money they'll have to forfeit if they fail a nicotine or cotinine urine test in 6 months quit at a higher rate than smokers who don't have that option, but are given the same sort of suite of standard quit tools. So 30% improvement just from having a way to put money on the line that you would have to forfeit, a way to find it.
That's really interesting. I can believe it. So you've written this book, How to Change. What are you kind of working on now? Are you improving the book? You're taking your research in a different direction? Where are you going? Where are you headed now?
Yeah, so I run a research center at the University of Pennsylvania with Angela Duckworth, who you might
Hmm.
know from her book Grit. I think you may
Yeah,
even have interviewed her on
I
this
did. Yes, I
program.
did. Yes, I did.
Yeah. So our research center, the Behavior Change for Good initiative, is basically trying to just accelerate science in this area. And we continue to do new massive research studies looking at ways to improve behavior change programs. So one thing that we just published, which was really exciting, and this was led, I should say, by Colin Kammerer at Caltech and a couple of awesome um, graduate students. It looked at whether or not we could use machine learning to model the speed at which people form habits and just better understand the process, and showed that actually habit formation, there's sort of no magic number of days it takes to form a habit, contrary to popular wisdom, with two massive data sets and about 52 million observations of both hospital caregivers trying to form habits around hand sanitizing, as well as gym patrons trying to form habits around exercise. We see just huge variability across people, but also across domains. So the average time it takes to form a habit around gym attendance, where you get really predictable and consistent, is about an order of magnitude a few months, where it's actually just a couple weeks in the context of something much simpler like sanitizing your hands. So we're trying to better understand, how do habits form, just observe. And then we're designing interventions, and a lot of our work is looking at social support interventions. How can we create groups of people who support each other and produce better outcomes? We're actually about to launch a massive randomized controlled trial with incoming freshmen across a bunch of different universities to see if we can help them achieve better grades and more of a sense of belonging by helping them connect with the right people and build friendship networks. So, lots of different work all in this area, and really excited to have new insights in the years ahead.
How did you, of all the different things you can study in organizational psychology or organizational behavior, how did you hone in on this thing about change? I mean, it seems like a great thing to focus around, but tell me a little bit about how you, honed in on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first got excited about, well, I've always been interested in change, and part of it is just, like me search, right? I was trying to change myself. I like all of us are, right? I was taking tough classes at fancy universities where I never felt up to the challenge, and I was like, how am I possibly gonna get through my computer science PhD, right? Like, how am I gonna get this done? How am I possibly gonna sort of stay in shape and not be a mess? So some of it was that I was like experimenting on myself, and then discovered some of these insights could be useful to other people. But the other big motivator that really helped me focus all of my research in this direction was when I was an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I started spending some time over at our medical school. So I was working at Wharton, the business school, but we have an incredible medical school with really terrific researchers doing work on medical decision making and trying to figure out how do we help people live healthier lives, take their medications more regularly, exercise more regularly, get their cancer screenings on time, and so on. And I was in this seminar one day. This is such a nerdy story, but it's true. It really did sort of change my life. And there was a graph that was up on a slide, and the graph was a graph from a 2007 paper that looked at the percentage of premature deaths in the US that are due to different causes that we can attribute to different sources. And it had sort of like, wedges in this pie chart for a bunch of things that you might think about causing premature death, right? Like accidents and environmental exposure and genetics. But one of the wedges was behaviors, daily decisions that we could change about things like what we eat, whether we're physically active, whether we smoke, whether we buckle up when we get in cars. And what blew my mind is that the biggest wedge in that graph by a pretty wide margin was those daily decisions. They accumulate for 40% of premature deaths. And I had not appreciated the impact of these small behavior changes that all of us want to make, and many of us struggle to succeed at making. I didn't realize how huge it would be if we could really make a dent in that problem. And of course, as soon as I saw the graph and started thinking about it in the medical context, it was pretty easy to draw the line to other settings where I was doing research that I cared about. Like I have done a bunch of work on financial decision making, trying to help figure out how do we get people to save more for retirement, and you know, things like education. How do we help kids study more and effectively and earn better grades? So if the pie chart wedge for daily decisions was bigger than I thought in the domain of health, almost certainly it was going to be bigger than I thought in those other settings too. These small decisions clearly really accumulate. And so it felt like, okay, wait, you know, there was a bunch of stuff I was doing. I'd looked at what makes headlines go viral on the New York Times, and I'd looked at what makes you hold your DVDs longer. But I'd also done some research around behavior change and how do we help people live healthier lives and save more and so on. And I was like, wait a minute, that is where I can have real impact. This is where I can really make the world a better place. And that's where I want to put the majority of my energy. And that sort of focused my work.
Well, Katy, it's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your taking time. It was great to hear your story. And when you do write another book, which I'm sure you will do, please come back and tell me about it.
Thank you so much for having me and for the great questions. I really enjoyed the chance to.
And please say hi to Angela Duckworth for me. She was a previous guest, and please say hi to her for me.
I will do that for sure.
This is Richard Hsu and Katy Milkman. Thanks.